December 1941, Tokyo. A bitter wind cuts through the streets outside the Imperial Navy headquarters. Inside, the glow of dim lamps casts long shadows over a polished map table. Around it, Japan's top admirals hunch over ink-stained documents, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling. Silence dominates, broken only by the scratching of pens and the occasional creak of leather chairs. On the table lies a set of calculations, neat columns of numbers representing fuel reserves, tanker capacities, and projected consumption rates. A single miscalculation hides in plain sight, a decimal misplaced, an assumption slightly off, but its consequences are invisible to the men around the table. The Imperial Navy believes it has enough oil to sustain a swift, decisive campaign across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Victory seems inevitable. The bombs over Pearl Harbor have not yet fallen, yet the seeds of disaster have already been sown. In a few months, Japan's war plans will collide with reality, and the empire will discover that a single mathematical error has quietly sealed its fate. By mid-1941, the Japanese empire stood at a crossroads. Expansion in China had drained resources for nearly a decade, and the dream of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere demanded energy, raw materials, and strategic foresight. Japan's industrial engine ran on oil, fuel for warships, aircraft, and mechanized units. Yet the archipelago itself produced almost no petroleum. Every barrel had to be imported, transporting across thousands of miles of ocean or captured from distant colonies. The United States, the British Empire, and the Dutch East Indies controlled the bulk of the world's oil. Japan's leaders were painfully aware of this. In July 1941, the United States imposed an oil embargo, freezing Japanese access to crude and refined fuel. Stocks held in storage were finite, calculations were made, assumptions drawn, but no one fully grasped the fragile balance. Reports predicted 6 months of operations could be sustained. 6 months. That was all the time Japan had to strike decisively before reserves would dwindle. At the highest levels of the Imperial Navy and Army, discussions of oil were tense and urgent. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's carrier strategy, had long warned that a prolonged conflict with the United States was a gamble. Yet political pressures and military ambition overruled caution. Japan's planners assumed that a swift, aggressive campaign would secure the oil-rich territories of Southeast Asia and neutralize American industrial potential before the barrels ran dry. These calculations rested on flawed assumptions. Tanker losses were underestimated, the distance of supply routes overstated, and consumption rates for warships and aircraft were slightly miscalculated, but these slight errors would compound over time. In Tokyo's dimly lit planning rooms, no one realized that the empire's most critical resource was slipping beyond control. Beyond numbers and strategy, the human element added complexity. Navy engineers worried about maintenance schedules, knowing that fuel shortages would cripple engines and leave ships dead in the water. Pilots trained in carrier operations feared that extended missions over the Pacific would push their machines beyond safe limits. Yet these warnings were drowned out by the optimism of high command. Japan had a plan. It was bold, decisive, and in their eyes, mathematically sound. The stakes were immense. Japan's military relied on the assumption that a series of quick victories could force Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States into negotiation. The logic was simple: secure oil, stabilize supply lines, and dominate the Pacific. But it depended on perfect execution, uninterrupted shipping, and the fragile illusion that enemy capabilities could be underestimated. Across the globe, the United States remained unaware of how near Japan's oil crisis truly was. While Tokyo calculated its 6-month window, Washington's industrial output was quietly ramping up, producing aircraft, carriers, and fuel at rates the Japanese could not anticipate. Every barrel of oil Japan thought it had accounted for was a thread in a fragile web, stretched across contested seas, vulnerable to submarines, storms, and miscalculation. By the fall of 1941, Japan's planners were on the verge of executing their gamble. The Pearl Harbor attack was months away, yet the clock on the empire's survival had already begun to tick. Every ship that steamed out of Tokyo Bay, every plane fueled and launched, moved the nation closer to a confrontation between ambition and reality, a confrontation whose outcome would hinge on a single hidden error in a ledger of numbers. In this fragile moment, the Empire's fate was not decided by enemy bullets or bombs, but by a subtle misjudgment, a miscalculation of fuel reserves that, at first invisible, would soon dictate the rhythm of war. The stage was set. Japan's ambitions in the Pacific depended on one fragile lifeline, the flow of oil across thousands of miles of open ocean. By 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had calculated that its tanker fleet could sustain the planned campaigns, moving fuel from occupied territories to forward bases. Yet the assumptions behind these calculations were deeply flawed. Tanker numbers were overestimated. Consumption rates for aircraft, carriers, and battleships were slightly off. And the enemy, submarines, reconnaissance aircraft, and the United States Navy posed risks that the planners underestimated. The logistical challenge was immense. A single carrier strike could burn thousands of barrels of fuel in a day. Battleships consumed hundreds more. Each island outpost required constant resupply, not just for combat operations, but for the maintenance of engines, generators, and vehicles. Japan's planners had drawn up detailed spreadsheets, tables of numbers showing projected consumption versus available reserves. On paper, the empire could last months. In reality, every variable was slightly skewed, each miscalculation compounding with distance, weather, and operational delays. Submarines prowled the sea lanes, and enemy intelligence was becoming increasingly effective. The Japanese assumed that their convoys would move unchallenged, that tanker losses would be minimal, and that captured oil fields would be rapidly brought online. They failed to account for the unpredictable variables of war, storms, mechanical failures, and human error. Even a single missing decimal point in calculations could, or would, cascade into strategic disaster. Political and military ambition also distorted judgment. Japan's leadership believed the US would negotiate if faced with early defeats. They assumed that the rapid seizure of oil-rich territories in the Dutch East Indies and Malaya would secure enough resources to sustain long-term operations. These assumptions were not purely technical, they were psychological, rooted in pride and the expectation of obedience to Japan's imperial will. This overconfidence blinded planners to the slowly accumulating reality. Fuel was finite, shipping routes were vulnerable, and production capacity was insufficient to sustain a drawn-out war. The empire's leaders did not fully appreciate how crucial timing would be. Every day of delay increased the risk that fuel reserves would dwindle below operational necessity. By the time the first carriers steamed toward Pearl Harbor, the empire's oil ledger already contained the seeds of disaster. No report explicitly flagged the discrepancy, and in the rush to act, the critical error remained invisible. Even in the field, commanders sensed the tension. Pilots flew longer missions than their fuel allowances safely permitted. Captains of ships rationed oil for engines, aware that resupply was uncertain. Engineers kept maintenance schedules flexible, improvising where possible, while logisticians calculated distance and tonnage with meticulous care, unaware that the base numbers themselves were flawed. The discrepancy was small, almost imperceptible, yet it was enough to doom operational planning if left unchecked. Japan's reliance on captured oil was equally optimistic. Planners assumed that swift victories would bring Dutch, British, and American oil installations under their control before reserves ran critically low. They imagined oil flowing from Sumatra, Borneo, and Burma, feeding forward operations across the Pacific. In practice, resistance slowed these campaigns. Infrastructure was often destroyed before it could be captured. Extraction was difficult, transport insecure, and delays mounted. By mid-1942, these miscalculations would become impossible to correct. By focusing on speed and aggression, the Imperial Navy and Army ignored the silent, invisible enemy, logistics itself. The fuel crisis was not a dramatic, visible event. It was a slow, invisible erosion, measurable only in spreadsheets, tank gauges, and operational reports. Yet this quiet failure would determine the outcome of every major campaign. Guadalcanal, Midway, the Solomons, each battle would reveal the consequences of this hidden miscalculation. As Japan moved toward its first major operations in the Pacific, the empire appeared confident, well supplied and ready to strike. Admirals and generals briefed maps with bold arrows showing forward thrusts across the sea. Pilots checked instruments, ships were fueled, and soldiers prepared to embark. But beneath the surface, the arithmetic of empire was already flawed. The ledger, the fuel estimates, the assumptions, they contained an invisible truth. Japan's strategic calculations were off by the smallest fraction, a decimal error, a misjudged rate of consumption, but that fraction would prove decisive. The stage was set for confrontation, not only with the United States, but with the limits of Japan's own planning. The coming months would test the empire's courage, skill, and ambition against the cold reality of fuel scarcity. And in the quiet, unremarkable numbers of a table, the seeds of a catastrophic failure had already been sown. For the sailors of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the fuel shortage was an invisible enemy, felt rather than seen. On carrier decks, pilots checked fuel gauges nervously, aware that a single miscalculation could strand them over open ocean. Battleship crews rationed diesel, knowing that every operation carried unseen risk. Engineers worked tirelessly in engine rooms, improvising repairs with limited resources, while officers calculated how far each ship could travel before running dry. The tension was quiet but pervasive. Fear was not of combat alone, it was the creeping awareness that the lifeblood of their fleet, the fuel that powered engines and aircraft alike, might vanish in the middle of a critical mission. Each refueling stop became a lifeline, each barrel of oil a treasure, and yet the numbers in the ledger suggested abundance. The contrast between paper and reality created a silent anxiety, one that would intensify as the war expanded across thousands of miles of ocean. The empire's technological might depended on fuel. Aircraft engines, carrier operations, and battleship turbines demanded precise quantities of oil. Zero fighters consumed thousands of liters during sorties. Fleet carriers burned tens of thousands daily during maneuvers. Tankers carried this precious cargo across exposed seas, but the calculations made in Tokyo had overlooked compounding variables: extended flight times, additional missions, unexpected mechanical inefficiencies, and losses due to enemy attacks. Even a fractional error in consumption estimates would multiply across the fleet. Engineers had designed the machines for optimal performance, but performance depended on fuel. Without it, aircraft could not take off, ships could not move, and entire operations would grind to a halt. The math, once a reassuring spreadsheet, had become a ticking clock, invisible yet merciless. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Japan's carrier strategy, understood the fragility of Japan's energy reserves. He warned repeatedly that a long war against the United States was untenable without securing vast oil reserves. Yet within the halls of the Imperial Navy and Army, competing factions prioritized speed, aggression, and honor over pragmatism. Decisions were made on assumptions of quick victory, often ignoring the subtle signs of resource scarcity. High-ranking officers signed off on operations with confidence, unaware that the calculations feeding their plans were flawed. Pride and optimism overruled caution, and a single misjudged number, an error in projected consumption or tanker availability, was allowed to persist unnoticed. Leadership believed in the mathematical soundness of their strategy, yet it rested on fragile assumptions that would soon unravel. Across the Pacific, the United States quietly built a reservoir of advantage that Japan would fail to anticipate. American oil production and refining capacity dwarfed that of the Japanese Empire. While Tokyo calculated consumption and tanker availability, Washington expanded refineries, built pipelines, and stockpiled petroleum. Each barrel Japan assumed it could capture or ration was counterbalanced by an American industrial machine that produced exponentially more. Submarine patrols, reconnaissance flights, and the growing reach of the U.S. Navy made Japanese logistics vulnerable. The numbers that Japan relied upon, tonnage of oil, tanker survivability, and projected consumption, failed to account for enemy interdiction and relentless production. In the invisible arithmetic of war, the balance was already tipping against the empire. Japan's operational ambitions placed extraordinary demands on its limited fuel reserves. Carrier operations across vast stretches of ocean required enormous quantities of oil. Even a single strike over Midway or the Solomon Islands burned tens of thousands of liters. Battleships steaming hundreds of miles consumed daily allocations faster than anticipated. Forward bases, intended to support prolonged campaigns, required constant resupply. Every convoy risked attack from submarines or aircraft, every delay further eroding operational efficiency. The miscalculation in fuel estimations was compounded by operational overreach. Japan assumed a linear relationship between fuel and success, failing to account for losses in transit, extended missions, and the unpredictability of weather or enemy action. The empire was building a house of cards, grand in ambition, fragile in logistics. Perhaps the most insidious effect of the fuel miscalculation was psychological. Pride, honor, and belief in imperial destiny blinded decision-makers. Admitting the mathematical error would have meant acknowledging vulnerability, something unthinkable in a culture that equated failure with shame. Subordinates feared the consequences of dissent. Superiors dismissed caution as defeatist. Sailors and pilots, sensing tension yet unaware of the exact calculations, carried out orders with a mixture of confidence and unease. Even as fuel became scarcer, the belief in Japan's inevitable victories persisted. This moral rigidity amplified the consequences of the era. The empire's failure was not only numerical but also psychological, a tragic testament to the human cost of pride entwined with miscalculation. By examining these angles, the human cost, technological dependency, leadership decisions, enemy advantage, operational strain, and moral blindness, a pattern emerges. Japan's empire, for all its ambition and early successes, rested on flawed arithmetic. The miscalculation was invisible yet unavoidable, a silent force shaping every decision, every mission, and every battle. The tension between ambition and arithmetic would soon erupt in decisive confrontations across the Pacific. The next stage of this story reveals the climax of Japan's hidden fuel crisis, where the consequences of these errors collide with the reality of war. Early 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had executed a series of stunning victories. Pearl Harbor, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies were conquered with speed and precision. On the surface, Japan appeared unstoppable, but beneath the surface, the lifeblood of the empire fuel was vanishing at a rate far faster than planners had anticipated. The ledger that once promised 6 months of operational capability was slowly unraveling. Guadalcanal marked the first signs of disaster. As the Japanese dispatched carriers, battleships, and transports to reinforce positions in the Solomon Islands, fuel consumption exceeded calculations. Tankers were delayed, lost, or destroyed by American submarines. Every misstep compounded the problem. Pilots on long-range missions returned with barely enough fuel to land. Battleships steamed cautiously, mindful of empty tanks and distant supply lines. Commanders began to sense a pattern, a creeping scarcity that no one had foreseen, one that could not be remedied in the midst of active operations. Meanwhile, the United States leveraged its oil advantage. Fleet oilers moved supplies to Pacific bases with precision, fueling carriers and battleships at rates the Japanese could not match. American submarines prowled critical shipping lanes, sinking tankers before they could reach forward positions. The Japanese empire had assumed that swift conquest would secure fuel sources, but each delay, each loss, magnified the already fatal error in calculations. By June 1942, during the Battle of Midway, the consequences became undeniable. Japan's carriers, intended to crush American naval power, were limited in their operational range by fuel availability. Every maneuver, every sortie, carried the hidden weight of scarcity. When American forces struck, Japanese losses were catastrophic. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu, were lost. Each carrier represented not only firepower, but also fuel reserves, aircraft, and personnel. The empire had overextended itself, and the miscalculated supply lines amplified the human and strategic cost. On Guadalcanal, the situation deteriorated further. Japanese troops, relying on minimal fuel shipments, struggled to sustain operations. Tanks were immobilized, generators faltered, and aircraft were grounded. Commanders improvised, sending small convoys into contested waters, but losses were relentless. The invisible arithmetic of oil dictated strategy. Decisions were no longer based solely on tactics or heroism. They were constrained by liters of fuel, barrels, and tanker capacities. The human toll mirrored the logistical crisis. Sailors exhausted by continuous operations, pilots facing impossible missions, and soldiers awaiting supplies felt the growing weight of scarcity. For the first time, the Empire's ambitious plans collided with reality. Where once bold strokes on a map promised victory, now the calculations, the small error overlooked in Tokyo months earlier, controlled the rhythm of war. The turning point was clear. Japan could no longer operate with freedom of choice. Each campaign, each attack, was constrained by resources that no longer met the demands of ambition. The Empire's numerical advantage in personnel and skill could not overcome the silent enemy fuel. The decisive victories of 1941, achieved with daring and precision, were now tempered by a creeping, unassailable limitation. The arithmetic of oil dictated the outcome before battles were fought. By late 1942, Japan's operational flexibility had eroded. In the Solomons, ships were tied to base proximity, aircraft carriers could launch only limited strikes, troop movements were calculated to the last gallon. The Empire's initial overconfidence, the assumption that fuel supply was sufficient for prolonged campaigns, was revealed as a strategic blunder. Each loss, each grounded aircraft, each immobilized ship was not merely a tactical setback. It was the inevitable result of an invisible error in calculation, one that no bravery or ingenuity could fully overcome. As the campaigns intensified, Japanese commanders realized the horrifying truth. Even with the early victories, the Empire's war machine was slowly grinding to a halt. The miscalculation was no longer a number on a page. It was a force shaping the course of the war, steering battles, operations, and ultimately the fate of the Empire itself. The stage was set for the final collapse of Japan's strategic freedom, a collapse that would play out in the next phase of the war, where desperation, attrition, and scarcity would dominate every decision. By 1944, the reality of Japan's hidden fuel crisis could no longer be ignored. The Empire's early conquests had yielded territory but not the promised resources. All rich islands were captured, yet infrastructure had been destroyed in retreating campaigns, pipelines sabotaged, and refineries damaged. Fuel shipments across contested seas were perilous, with American submarines and air power systematically targeting tankers and supply lines. Japan's mathematical error, initially subtle, nearly invisible, now dictated strategy with ruthless precision. The operational consequences were devastating. Battleships, once symbols of naval supremacy, remained tied to port, immobilized by empty tanks. Aircraft carriers, Japan's pride, could not launch sustained strikes. Pilots grounded their aircraft as fuel dwindled. Forward bases became isolated islands of inefficiency. Every sortie and maneuver had to be carefully rationed, each decision informed more by liters of oil than by strategic opportunity. The Empire's war machine, previously unstoppable in appearance, was now constrained by arithmetic. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 starkly illustrated this reality. Japan committed its remaining fleet in a desperate attempt to stem the American advance, yet fuel shortages limited their speed and operational reach. Ships could not execute complex maneuvers, aircraft were launched in smaller numbers, often without sufficient fuel to return safely. Admirals and captains faced impossible choices: engage the enemy knowing that fuel would not sustain withdrawal, or hold back and concede strategic positions. The miscalculation from 1941, one assumption about tanker availability, had rippled through the war, rendering even bold tactics ineffective. On land, the impact was equally severe. The Japanese army in the Philippines and Southeast Asia struggled to supply mechanized units and aircraft. Generators failed, vehicles stalled, and defensive positions became untenable. Soldiers faced a silent adversary in addition to American forces: scarcity. Medical units rationed fuel for ambulances, engineering units postponed repairs. The operational tempo slowed under the weight of an invisible constraint. The human cost compounded as exhaustion, stress, and rationing eroded morale. By early 1945, The Empire's predicament was unmistakable. Tokyo's war rooms recorded dwindling fuel stockpiles with growing alarm. Tanker convoys became prime targets, and losses mounted daily. Aircraft carriers were reduced to skeleton operations. Battleships, immobilized in harbor, could no longer influence the course of battles. Even kamikaze missions, Japan's desperate tactic, were hampered by insufficient fuel, leaving pilots stranded or missions incomplete. The once mighty naval and air forces of the Empire had been reduced to fragments, all because of a calculation made 3 years prior. The final months of the war laid bare the full consequences of the hidden error. Operation Shogo, the Japanese naval plan to defend the Philippines, failed not solely because of enemy action, but because fuel limitations prevented full execution. Ships could not maneuver as intended, aircraft could not provide adequate support, and troop movements were delayed or cancelled. American forces, aware of Japan's logistical vulnerability, pressed the advantage. The Empire's early brilliance, built on daring and precision, now collided with the immutable reality of arithmetic. Victory had become mathematically impossible. Even as cities burned and soldiers fought to the last, the invisible calculation haunted every decision. Each failure to maneuver, each grounded aircraft, each lost convoy traced back to the subtle miscalculation of fuel reserves in 1941. The Empire's downfall was not a sudden catastrophe. It was the cumulative effect of months and years of operational strain, amplified by a single, fatal error in planning. The silent adversary of Japan's war effort, its own misjudged resources, had now become undeniable. Admirals, generals, and planners could no longer ignore the numbers. Desperation, attrition, and dwindling reserves dictated strategy, leaving bold ambition powerless. The once celebrated victories of 1941 now seemed like a fleeting illusion, a brief window in which the Empire could have consolidated power. That window had closed, and the consequences of miscalculation were irreversible. As the Imperial Navy limped from battle to battle, as troops faced shortages on islands across the Pacific, and as the Empire's leadership confronted the harsh arithmetic of war, the truth became clear. Japan had lost before it could even fight all the battles necessary for victory. The decimal error, the fuel miscalculation hidden in Tokyo's war rooms, had quietly decided the fate of the Empire. The stage was set for the aftermath, where the human, operational, and strategic consequences of this error would be fully revealed, where the cost of ambition colliding with miscalculation would echo across the Pacific and into history. By mid-1945, the consequences of Japan's hidden fuel crisis were undeniable. Ships once capable of dominating the Pacific were immobilized in harbors, their massive engines silent, awaiting fuel that would never arrive. Aircraft carriers lay idle, their decks empty or sparsely populated, a shadow of their former power. Battleships, once symbols of imperial might, could not leave port without risking disaster. The Empire's fleet, celebrated in 1941 as unstoppable, had been reduced to fragments, its movements dictated not by strategy or courage, but by the cold arithmetic of scarcity. On land, Japanese forces faced equally dire conditions. Tanks and mechanized units were grounded. Generators failed, leaving forward bases without power. Soldiers scavenged fuel for essential operations, improvising wherever possible, yet the sheer scale of the shortage made improvisation a temporary, insufficient measure. Medical units rationed fuel for ambulances, engineering units could not operate machinery. Even daily life for troops became a logistical struggle, with morale eroding under the constant pressure of scarcity. The human cost was profound. Sailors and pilots, trained for precision and speed, faced the crushing weight of operational limitations. Aircrews grounded by fuel shortages endured frustration and fear. Soldiers awaiting resupply faced the anxiety of knowing that every mission, every defensive maneuver was compromised before it began. Fuel, a seemingly abstract resource, had become the most immediate and decisive adversary of the Empire. Japan's strategic options had evaporated. No longer could bold maneuvers, surprise attacks, or rapid deployments determine outcomes. Every decision required calculations in liters of fuel and tanker availability rather than tactical advantage. The Empire's operational tempo slowed to a crawl, and every missed opportunity, every delayed strike. Traced back to the hidden miscalculation made in 1941. Meanwhile, Allied forces leveraged this advantage with methodical precision. American and Allied planners, aware of Japan's reliance on long supply lines, targeted tankers and refineries, crippling what remained of the empire's oil logistics. Submarines patrolled sea lanes relentlessly, sinking Japanese convoys with devastating effect. Airstrikes destroyed key fuel depots and refineries, compounding shortages. The invisible error in Tokyo's calculations had been magnified by enemy action, turning a subtle misjudgment into a decisive factor in the outcome of the war. The failure of Japan's fuel strategy also influenced operational decisions in desperate ways. Kamikaze missions, once conceived as psychological and tactical tools, became partially dictated by fuel availability. Pilots were launched with minimal reserves, unable to adjust to changing circumstances, their missions bound by the unforgiving arithmetic of scarcity. Naval and air operations became fragmented, limited, and ultimately insufficient to halt the Allied advance. By the summer of 1945, Japan's industrial capacity had collapsed. Factories that depended on consistent fuel supplies for machinery, electricity, and transportation had slowed to a crawl or stopped entirely. The war effort had become reactive rather than proactive, with every campaign constrained by a resource that should have been abundant in a properly calculated strategy. In retrospect, the empire's ambitious campaigns, initially celebrated for boldness and innovation, now appeared reckless, a house of cards built on miscalculated numbers and unacknowledged risk. The arithmetic error that had begun as a subtle misjudgment in Tokyo's war rooms now defined history. It determined the pace of operations, the fate of entire fleets, and the survival of troops across thousands of miles of ocean. Victory, which Japan had assumed lay within reach through speed, strategy, and courage, was mathematically impossible. The stage was set for the second part of the aftermath, where the post-war analyses, historical reflections, and the enduring legacy of this miscalculation would be fully revealed. The war ended with Japan's surrender in August 1945, but the full consequences of the hidden fuel crisis lingered long after the guns fell silent. Post-war analyses revealed the magnitude of the empire's miscalculations. American occupation authorities meticulously documented Japan's logistical failures, examining fuel stockpiles, tanker losses, and operational reports. Historians discovered that a single misjudged assumption in 1941, an overestimation of available oil reserves and tanker capacity, had reverberated across every theater of the Pacific War. The Imperial Navy, once a symbol of technical brilliance and strategic audacity, had been immobilized not solely by enemy firepower, but by arithmetic. 4 carriers lost at Midway, hundreds of planes grounded for lack of fuel, and immobilized battleships in Yokosuka and Kure reflected not just tactical defeat, but the inescapable consequences of flawed calculations. Ships rusted at harbor, engines idle, a silent testament to the hidden error that had guided strategy for 4 years. Japanese historians and military analysts later acknowledged that the empire's leadership had underestimated the vulnerability of its fuel supply lines. Decisions made at the top, fueled by pride, optimism, and the assumption of rapid victory, ignored subtle warning signs. Even warnings from Admiral Yamamoto and other pragmatic officers were discounted in favor of bold campaigns. The fuel miscalculation was not merely a technical error. It was a reflection of institutional overconfidence and a failure to reconcile ambition with arithmetic. The human toll, too, was stark. Thousands of soldiers, sailors, and airmen suffered and died because missions were constrained by fuel shortages. Forward bases became isolated, evacuation and resupply missions were impossible. The silent arithmetic of oil dictated who could fight, who could move, and who would perish. Post-war testimonies described the quiet despair of crews who knew that their operational limitations were dictated not by enemy strength alone, but by barrels of fuel that would never arrive. Beyond immediate consequences, the fuel crisis shaped Japan's post-war military doctrine. Planners studied the lessons of 1941-1945 with rigor. Modern strategies emphasized resource security, accurate logistical forecasting, and recognition of the limits imposed by geography and supply. The empire's collapse had demonstrated that no matter the skill of commanders, the courage of troops, or the power of ships and aircraft, victory was impossible without a realistic understanding of logistics. In the broader context, Japan's hidden fuel crisis stands as a lesson in the imperceptible forces that can decide history. It was not solely guns, planes, or carriers that determined the fate of the empire. It was the quiet, invisible arithmetic of resources. A single decimal error, unnoticed in 1941, had rippled through the Pacific campaigns, shaping strategy, constraining operations, and ultimately sealing the empire's fate. The empire's downfall serves as a reminder that warfare is as much about calculation and supply as it is about valor and tactics. The hidden miscalculation in Tokyo's war rooms, unnoticed for years, exemplifies the intersection of human ambition, technological dependency, and the unforgiving logic of mathematics. As the sun set over the Pacific in the final months of the war, empty harbors and grounded fleets stood as silent witnesses. The Japanese empire, once radiant in its ambition, had been humbled by a truth invisible to its leaders. Victory depends not on audacity alone, but on the relentless precision of planning, supply, and the immutable laws of arithmetic. The story of Japan's hidden fuel crisis is not only a tale of war, it is a lesson in the quiet forces that shape history. In 1941, a single miscalculation, a decimal misplaced, and assumptions slightly off, remained invisible to the empire's leaders. Yet over the course of 4 years, it dictated strategy, constrained operations, and ultimately decided the fate of an empire. This was not a failure of bravery or skill. Japanese sailors, pilots, and soldiers displayed extraordinary courage and ingenuity, often overcoming impossible circumstances. It was not a failure of technology. The Zero fighter, the carrier fleet, and the battleships were marvels of design. The failure was arithmetic, the cold, unyielding logic of logistics that no heroism could override. The empire had assumed abundance where scarcity existed, speed where patience was required, and certainty where the future was unknowable. The consequences reverberated across the Pacific. Grounded aircraft, immobilized ships, and stalled campaigns were the visible signs of an invisible era: human lives. Heroic actions and strategic ambitions all collided with the immutable reality of resources. The Japanese empire, for all its audacity and precision, discovered that even the boldest plans falter when calculations are flawed. Today, this hidden miscalculation stands as a warning. It reminds military planners, leaders, and strategists that victory depends not only on courage, skill, or innovation, but also on careful, precise accounting of the forces that sustain operations, logistics, supply, and resources. A single overlooked variable can transform triumph into disaster. And yet there is a human dimension as well. In the quiet moments between battles, sailors and soldiers endured, adapted, and persevered. Their courage underscores a universal truth. While arithmetic may govern strategy, human resilience persists in the face of constraints imposed by miscalculation. In the end, Japan's hidden fuel crisis was both a technical failure and a human story, a convergence of ambition, error, and the inexorable logic of resources. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by bold strokes and decisive battles, but also by the invisible numbers that quietly, relentlessly, determine the fate of nations.